There was only one period in history and one place in the world that developed armour like this, fully encased plate armour, of the late medieval period, the 14th, 15th and 16th centuries. And the best quality armour of this kind made the wearer invulnerable pretty much to many types of weapons, including arrows and lances. And so of course they had to devise specialised weapons like the poleaxe to deal with these opponents wearing fully encased plate harness. And even swords, as a result of the difficulty of overcoming fully armoured opponents, had to develop into special forms and be used in special ways, which we'll talk about more in this video. And of course daggers had to evolve into special forms to overcome the armour as well. But what we're going to look at in this video is 5 iconic weapons from history that are pretty much useless against fully armoured opponents. Hi folks, Matt Eaton here, Scholar Gladiator. Now most viewers of this channel will be very familiar with things like the rondel dagger or the knightly poleaxe, which were really evolved in an age when plate armour was a major factor both on the battlefield and also in knightly duels, and these weapons evolved to deal with that level of armour. But of course medieval knights fought against all different types of opponents, and in some cases we can make some fantasy hypothetical matchups where they didn't fight those people, but they could have done because they existed at the same time. So here we're going to look in this video at 5 iconic, famous and successful weapons which would have been absolutely terrible weapons to have to use against a fully armoured late medieval knight. So today's sponsors for the video are Raid Shadow Legends, who've been a great support to the channel across the years. And whether you're new to Raid or an existing player, I've got some special deals for you here that are absolutely free, so you're not going to want to miss out. And for those who don't know, there's a bunch of different ways to enjoy playing Raid. We've got the campaign, dungeons, faction wars, the arena, clan bosses. Personally, my favourite is fighting other people's teams in the arena. And Raid's got famously smooth and awesome graphics that are really good on PC, Mac, or of course on your mobile phone. One of the ways you get new champions is by opening up shards. And I've actually accumulated a few, so let's open some more shards now. I have a void shard here, which I really should have opened before now, but who's it gonna be? Oh, I don't know this guy. Denid the Tusk Knight. Only costs 500 silver to open one of these. Ooh, Thrall. Okay, I've had quite a few of these. These are pretty common. So what I'll probably do is liquidize him. I'm gonna open up a sacred shard. Oh, okay, the Mistress of Hymns. Epic, yes! So if you're a new player, then there's never been a better time to start. I've got a fantastic offer for you here. When you get started, having legendary or epic heroes makes all of the difference, and that's what I'm going to offer you here. So when you first register, we're going to give you the legendary Raf-Matab, an HP Spirit champion from the Barbarians faction. And his kit's built around resisting enemy effects of locking down foes with Provoke. But there's more. Once you reach level 10, you're going to get Allure. She is a very memorable, epic magic attack champion from the Demon Spawn faction. Her AAA1 attack reduces the target's turn meter by 25% on each critical hit. So by clicking that link down below or scanning the QR code on screen right now, you can get Raf-Matab right now, and then you'll get Allure when you get to level 10. But also for new players, don't forget the promo codes Get Alice to get Alice the Wanderer, Desert Queen to get a super overpowered Void legendary to Hanarak, and Kitty Cut to get the Cheshire Cat, and Go Fast to get Rezelvarg. Once you're in the game and crushing your enemies, you can come and find me. I'm called Captain Context in game, and maybe you can even join my clan. Right, so thanks for sticking with me, and thanks again to the sponsors for this video. Now let's look at 5 iconic weapons from history, which I believe, and feel free to disagree in the comments, or perhaps expand on or agree with me in the comments, I think these would have been absolutely useless had they been forced to be used against a fully armoured late medieval knight. So the first one is pretty much any Japanese sword. Now I happen to have picked one up at random, which happens to be a sort of okatana with a Naginata Nyoshi blade. And now, funnily enough, this is one of the best sort of adapted weapons that if you absolutely had to use it against a fully armoured late medieval knight, possibly would be slightly better than a standard katana or tachi or wakizashi, because this is a little bit bigger, a little bit longer, quite stiff, quite thick cross-section, and quite a good point. Now, why do I say that Japanese swords would have been terribly adapted to fighting against fully armoured medieval knights? Well, the first issue is the design of the blade, so the shape of it. We'll talk about that in a second. And the second issue is the material of the blade. Okay, I'm going to deal with the material first. So the Japanese swords are very famous for having very hard edges, up to 60 Rockwell, even higher sometimes, whereas a typical medieval sword is usually in the region of 40 to 50 Rockwell, so quite considerably softer. That being said, hardness often comes with brittleness. Now many of you say, oh but Matt, these swords folded 1,000 times often had soft backs, and that's completely true. But that is a double whammy of inconvenience for fighting against an armoured opponent, because first of all you have a hard but brittle edge which is not really designed for impacting with other hard objects, such as steel plate armour, which the late medieval knight was covered in. And it's not just the plate harness, the plate armour that's a problem, also mail, brigandine, all of the other types of defences that this would have come into contact with. When trying to overcome an armoured knight, what would have happened to the sword? Well, we've got a double whammy problem. The hard, brittle point and edge would have got chipped and broken away quite quickly, and the soft back would have bent. Why is bending a problem? Because a huge degree of fighting in armour comes down to half swording, and in fact the Japanese did the same. The Japanese often supported their blade in fighting in Japanese samurai style yoroi or armour. They did also half sword, as the Europeans did, because it's a very good way of applying more accurate thrusts to gaps and having leverage for hooking and throwing and wrestling and everything else. But the problem is, this is a blade which, against a fully armoured and quite heavy, therefore covered in plate, armoured opponent is likely to bend in half swording, and the point is going to break off and chip off against steel armour, which is a really big problem because thrusting into gaps is one of the main ways that you overcome a late medieval knight. So as well as the material, the edge and point being too brittle and the back being too soft, the other problem is we have got a problem of shape here. First of all, yes, these are fantastic cutting swords. However, cutting is almost completely irrelevant against a late medieval knight because you can't cut through plate armour, despite what you might see in some anime and movies. The next problem is the point and the shape of the point. Now, it's not a terrible point. We're actually going to look at swords which have even worse points in a second, but this isn't really well adapted to punching through mail. Now, obviously, you're not going to thrust through plate. The only weapons which really stand any chance of getting through actual plate directly by penetration are arrows, lances, and sometimes something like a halberd or a poleaxe head. Debatably, thinner plates, and if they're made of iron rather than hardened steel, but we do have records of it happening. So this point is not really well shaped for that. In fact, if we look at the points on European weapons, number one, they are a lot more slender. So they go into the mail and are quite far through the gap. So for example, in an armpit or inside of an arm or anywhere around the neck or something like that, they get quite a long way through the mail before they burst the mail ring. So these are mail bursting points. Far better adapted to fighting against late medieval European plate armour. And even if we look at things like the longsword or arming sword, they also have reinforced points that are quite narrow at the tip and designed for doing the same job. So Japanese swords overall, pretty terrible at dealing with a late medieval knight. Let's get on to the next one. Now, the next terrible weapon for fighting against a late medieval knight might surprise you because it is actually potentially a medieval knightly weapon, but from a slightly earlier period. That is the falchion. Okay, this is a sort of Conyers or Cluny type falchion. This is a type of weapon which was really popular in the 12th and 13th centuries, and there were forms of falchion still being very popularly used in the 14th and 15th centuries, but they had to change the design. Why? Fundamentally, because of this. Because of this tip. Okay, so as mentioned, when you're fighting against a fully armoured opponent in full plate harness, most of the fighting is either about stabbing into gaps, be they armpits, vision slits, back of the gauntlet, whatever, or wrestling, that is leverage. Now this theoretically could be used for half swording. So I'm not going to say that there's nothing you could do with it. And of course, you could give very formidable cuts and blows, which might possibly overwhelm an opponent. Now, I've made a big point in the past about pointing out these falchions are not as heavy as you would think they are. This one, for example, weighs about 1500 grams, so it's not especially heavy. It's as heavy as some beefy arming swords because it has a thin and flexible blade, a bit like a large machete. So this is really designed for hacking into opponents who are wearing things like gambesons, or even lighter armour in some cases, fabric, or at most mail, and occasionally donking someone on the helmet. And it has to be said, hitting people on the head, especially when you've got a a top-heavy weapon like this with quite a broad blade, or something like a mace or an axe, hitting people in the head can discombobulate them, as Sherlock Holmes would say in the Guy Ritchie films. So clearly, I mean, even just a heavy stick hitting someone really hard, funnily enough, I saw it this weekend, a heavy stick hitting someone hard in a helmet can have a surprising effect because, like being punched, it knocks the brain around and can be quite unpleasant. So it's not going to directly injure the person through the helmet, but it will injure potentially the brain inside the helmet. So absolutely, these can be used for giving blows. However, what's your armoured opponent going to be doing while you're swinging for the fences and trying to bruise or discombobulate them through their armour? Well, quite simply, they're going to be using a sword like this, closing in and stabbing you and finishing off quite quickly. They don't even need to use a sword. They could go straight for a rondel dagger and just go, okay, I'm in my plate harness, I'm going to soak in these blows. They could even cover up their head with their arm harness because, let's face it, arm harness by itself is incredibly protective. So they can even soak up the blows, wade in and start stabbing you into gaps. So the falchion, at least the early forms of falchion, when they don't have adapted points which are better for thrusting, are pretty much useless against a fully plated armoured knight. So the next weapon which might be useless, although you could potentially use to some degree, I'll talk about that in a second, but overall is fairly useless for fighting armour, might surprise you because they were actually sometimes carried by fully armoured people. And that's the rapier. Now, I think most people don't think about rapiers in the same kind of sentence as they're thinking about late medieval knights. But ironically, they did actually exist at the same time in the 16th century as there were still people wearing full armour, or sometimes half armour, you know, with just like half the legs, for example. And so absolutely these were used at the same time. And if we look at something like the Siege of Malta, then we see some of the knights actually wearing rapiers. So what the hell were they doing with them? Well, obviously in that context and on most battlefields, these armoured cuirassiers or knights could use a rapier because most of the people they were fighting against weren't in full plate armour, quite fundamentally. Okay, so if you're riding around on horseback and you are the heavy cavalry, then absolutely you can deliver a cavalry charge against some pikemen or some gunners because they're not wearing full armour. Yes, sometimes they might have a breastplate and a helmet, but you can thrust at the face, cut at the arms, all of this kind of stuff that, you know, frankly, as a trained swordsman, you should know how to do. So these swords weren't useless in the age of plate, potentially, but I would say that they were pretty bad against another opponent in plate. And let's be honest about it, when we go to like the English Civil War, for example, what do we actually find cuirassiers armed with for dealing with other cuirassiers? Well, number one, we find them armed with pistols, okay, because obviously pistols were a thing by that point, but they also have things like shortened versions of this poleaxe or warhammer or mace. So whether we're looking at like Polish winged lancers or whether we're looking at English roundhead cavalry, they're often armed with specialist weapons or, you know, estocks and things like this, weapons meant for dealing with other armoured opponents. So while they might be wearing and carrying one of these for general use against lightly equipped infantry or perhaps light cavalry, they don't use this against other armoured foes because it is a bad weapon to use against other foes. Why? Well, it's got a great point. So when we were talking about Japanese swords or talking about the falchions, the problem was the point. Well, actually, this has got a great point. And moreover, these can be half-sworded with. Okay, so absolutely in rapier treatises for certain techniques. And for example, against spears. So one of the techniques is actually to use this as a parrying device against a spear in order to close in and then deliver your own attack with the sword. So these can be half-sworded with, and they've got a good point. So I hear you cry at the screen, so Matt, tell us, why are they so bad against armour? Well, fundamentally, they're not very robust. Now, while they're not as fragile as some people might think, they have flexible blades, okay? And one of the features that we find when we look at long swords and arming swords, in fact, in the period of plate armour, is we end up with quite stiff blades. So they do flex, but not very much. And that's one of the reasons that we get this narrower profile in the age of plate armour because that enables you to keep the weight about the same. So you make it a bit narrower this way, but you make it thicker this way. And that gives you a very stiff estoc-like bar for jamming into gaps in armour, or indeed for wrestling. And remember, a lot of times you're throwing or levering or hooking with this blade, and stiffness is very important. So the problem in this context, got a lot of swords here. The problem in this context is that the blades are not really stiff enough on most rapiers because they are too narrow. Although they're not particularly thin, they're narrow, and so overall they're relatively flexible. Also, just general robustness. They're not really designed for this kind of rough and tumble bashing against bits of armour or being used as a lever to throw people and this kind of stuff. So they're not really strong enough. And there is a final problem, and it's not true of all rapiers. So the hilts. So hilts are fantastic for providing protection to the unarmoured or gloved hand, okay? But in armour you're wearing gauntlets, and the problem is a lot of gauntlets simply won't fit into these types of hilts. And that was clearly a problem, an acknowledged problem of the swept hilts and obviously later on cup hilts, because there were certain types of rapiers intended to be carried on the battlefield by people with gauntlets that have simplified hilts, sometimes just a crossguard, sometimes just a side ring. So absolutely, they acknowledged this and they adapted to it, and they did make swords to be carried by armoured people, but most of the time they weren't intended to be used against other armoured people, because they're fairly poor for that purpose. Now the next example is a little bit silly because it's not from the same time period, okay? But I felt I had to include it because it's a very iconic and popular type of sword, a type of sword that I love, but it's of its time, and it would have been terribly adapted to fight against late medieval knights. However, you sometimes do see the scenario of medieval knight versus Viking, okay? Viking swords are terribly adapted to dealing with a late medieval knight, although, to give them their credit, in some ways perhaps not as bad as some of the other examples that we've looked at here. So the primary problem with them is they are primarily cutting swords. Cutting, which is going to do absolutely nothing at all against people wearing full plate armour. Okay, it will just ding off them. Also, and to be fair, talking about the material that they're made of, so they suffer some of the problems that Japanese swords suffer from, in that very often they are made of multiple bars of iron and steel, and they have hard edges and they have a soft core, and they're more likely, although modern ones tend to be springy, a lot of the period ones, not always, they could be crucible steel, they could be Ulfberts, but most of them would have, if you'd gone like this, would have stayed bent because they had a soft core. A bit like a Japanese sword, actually. And also, they weren't even as hard on the edge as Japanese swords are. They were usually more like 40 Rockwell or even lower in some cases of ones that have been tested. But the main problem is that they don't have a suitable point. That point is not going to achieve anything. These types of spatulate points just won't do anything against mail. In some cases, they'll be too fat to get between gaps of plates. Maybe sometimes you could slide them between a plate, but overall that is a terrible point design. It's great for cutting and it's great for thrusting people not wearing armour, but it's a terrible point design really for getting through mail or thrusting in the gaps of late medieval plate armour. But it's not what it was designed for. However, the one thing that does go in its favour is they're fairly robust, and in fact a lot of Viking era swords are actually heavier than later medieval swords. Some of them are really big and beefy, so they can be quite big old clods of iron, and a little bit like the falchion that we looked at before. They would be not too bad in half swording because they're fairly rigid, and also because they're fairly broad, they're less likely to break or anything like that, like a rapier. So actually they're fairly robust. So for wrestling, they might not be too bad, but you can only really use them for hooking and throwing in the ways that we would use a longsword or an arming sword later on. The problem is you don't really have a thrusting point. The only other thing I would mention, and this goes for falchions as well, is theoretically you could swing them with a morthal, which I know, or mortschlag, which some people will mention in the comments, murder strike, so hitting with the hilt end instead of the blade. But that is a kind of specialised, not particularly, I don't think, widespread technique. It's featured in the fencing treatises, I think, more as a kind of, hey, look what I can do. I don't think it particularly won any battles. Anyway, so the main problem with the Viking era sword is perhaps the material that it's made from, but especially the tip shape. Terrible for facing a late medieval knight, but overall as an object, as a piece of metal, quite robust and quite tough. Now the final sword we're going to look at, I actually think is a fair one to include in here because it absolutely was in use, although this is a slightly later style that we're going to look at here. But this basic type of sword, this family of swords, was in use at the time of plate armour. It's just that they didn't very often have to face them. And that is the Shamshir, and this could also be applied to the Turkish kilich. Now, admittedly, if we go back to the 14th and 15th centuries, there are versions of the Shamshir and versions of the kilich which are better adapted to dealing with armour because they tend to be a little bit straighter, they sometimes have more falchion-like ends, and very often they have reinforced tips for thrusting. Almost exactly because of dealing with armour, because of course not only did European knights wear armour, but the Mamluks wore armour, the Persians wore armour, the Ottomans wore armour. Now, it wasn't the same as European late medieval plate armour, so it's not fair to compare them exactly. They weren't dealing with the same issues. The Mongols had quite comprehensive armour, but again, lamella, very different to European plate armour. So why is the Shamshir so terribly, terribly adapted to fighting against a fully plated armoured opponent? Well, firstly, cutting. It's primarily a cutting sword. Okay, it's highly curved, or at least curved to some degree, completely worthless, completely meaningless against a fully armoured opponent. You can't cut through armour, it's not going to do anything. Secondly, the material that the blade's made of can be somewhat on the fragile side, I would say, but you've got a fine edge that's going to get chewed up very quickly against armour, and it just doesn't really have, it's not like a falchion, it doesn't have a lot of authority in the hit, although, as I say, earlier kilich do have a lot more. So the cutting is kind of worthless. But secondly, the tips, this is where I'm going to say something positive, the tips on them are actually quite good. If we actually just isolate that tip for a second, that's a really good tip. It's kind of akin to, look, if I just grab the rundle dagger, it's not that far off, it's not as thick. But some of them are quite thick at the end. I have got an antique example which is quite thick. So they actually have got quite good tips. So here's the kind of curveball in this thing. You would think, okay, well, it's useless for cutting and it's got a terrible tip. No, it's actually got a good tip. In theory, that tip is great for stabbing into gaps in armour. But half swording with such a curved blade is really weird, because half swording kind of works on the basis that you can push in the straight line that the point is aiming in. But the problem is, and this would even for slightly curved kiliches, but obviously this is a very curved Shamshir, the problem is you can't push in the direction of the point. So while it's a very pointy point and theoretically good at stabbing through stuff, you can't apply a lot of pressure to it because it's so curved and pushing in the wrong direction. Also, in terms of general half swording, trying to kind of hook and lever and everything with such a curved blade, while you can do it for cutting actions in close action, and there are some records of people using Shamshir like this in close order, for actually half swording in a sort of useful kind of leverage and hooking and wrestling sense, it's a bit weird. You can do it, but it's not very good. And of course, European swords also tend to have more sticking out the back end. And while we hook and thrust with the front and lever with the front, we're often either hitting or levering with the back end as well. So even arming swords, you know, you don't need a huge amount of grip sticking out the back to get around in front of someone's helmet and pull them over, or hit them in the face with the pommel. Whereas the Shamshir and the kilich, admittedly, some early kiliches do actually have longer grips, in fairness, from the sort of middle of the 1400s. But overall, there isn't much there to do anything with. It's just a short grip because it's designed to be used as a one-handed, mostly cavalry slashing sword. So pretty bad overall, despite the fact it's got a nice thin tip, pretty bad overall at trying to face a late medieval European knight. So you know, clearly in history, in Europe, in the late medieval and Renaissance, specialised weapons were developed fighting against armoured opponents because they are difficult to overcome. If you're going to hit them, you have to devise how is that hit going to have enough effect to do anything at all, because most hits, as Decretem regularly shows, most hits don't put people out of action if they're wearing good plate armour. Moreover, if you're going to get into wrestling, how is that weapon going to aid you in wrestling? If it's going to aid you in wrestling, ironically, one of the simplest weapons of all time, a knife, is one of the best weapons in wrestling, and most types of knife, any type of knife with a decent point on it, will be useful in wrestling an armoured opponent. But in terms of swords, you really, for the most part, want a stiff, durable, strong blade with a narrow, sharp point, basically an S-stock. And pretty much every other type of sword is going to be deficient at fighting fully armoured, plated foes. Anyway, do you think, would you like to know, rather, about any other specific types of weapons and how they would have fared against a fully armoured knight? I'm happy to entertain those questions. And also, you know, suggestions. Do you think there are other types of sword from elsewhere in the world that would have been particularly good against plated armoured foes that I didn't cover here? Interested to see your comments down below. And remember to go and download the link and play Raid Shadow Legends for free right now. Anyway, thanks a lot for watching. I have been Matt Easton. I will hopefully continue to be, and I will hopefully also see you back on the channel really soon. Cheers, folks.
Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers, folks.